everyone, and welcome to this training on the supporter role in the CARE Act. This training will provide an overview of that supporter role, and it's meant to orient volunteer supporters around their role and responsibilities. On the next slide, we wanted to make you aware of a resource we have. This is a brief on the supporter's role in the CARE Act. It covers a number of topics, including what it entails, who the supporter can be, some key operating principles, and some logistics about how they're selected and how it could change throughout the process. So that's available for you as well. We cover a lot of that information in this training, but another resource for you. And wanted to point out some additional trainings that are available for volunteer supporters to help better understand your role. So we have some trainings on the CARE Act process and what the care plan and agreement are. We have a number of trainings that are recorded specifically for volunteer supporters, including an overview of supported decision-making framework, a series on trauma-informed care, what that looks like, things to consider, elimination of bias, then some trainings on psychiatric advance directives, family psychoeducation as well. So those are some trainings that you have available for you as a supporter in your role. So now let's take a look at what we will cover in this training. So like we mentioned, we're covering the role of the supporter, and we're going to explore the role of the volunteer supporter through a case study and then outline what that role looks like, some requirements and some components of that role. So the goal of this training, some learning objectives, is that you as a volunteer supporter will have a better understanding or an increased understanding of your responsibilities of the volunteer supporter role, and then identify key listening and communication skills for this volunteer supporter to make decisions. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to our presenters today. So we are joined by Dari Pogash and Barry Jacobs, and I'll let them introduce themselves and go into the overview of the volunteer supporter role. So Dari?
Hi, my name is Dari Pogash. I'm an attorney, and I spent several years representing people with mental illness for the District of Columbia's Protection and Advocacy Program for people with disabilities. I've also worked on policy issues related to disability rights and elder justice, and most recently worked for the District of Columbia's Department of Aging and Community Living, where I worked with adult protective services and case management services. I've done a lot of work on supported decision-making and have been working with this on the CARE Act and looking at and explaining how the volunteer supporter can work with the CARE Act respondent under a supported decision-making framework. And I'll pass the introductions over to Barry.
Thank you so much, Dari, and really good to be here with all of you. So I'm a clinical psychologist in Pennsylvania, have been one for 30 years, working in behavioral health and medical settings. And I'm also something of a national expert on families providing caregiving to a loved one with chronic and serious illness, including serious mental illness. As a clinician, I provided psychotherapy to families who, for the most part, have adult children who have schizophrenia and really are struggling to provide as much protection, as much care, and as much love for that person, that child, as they can, while at the same time trying to really support their self-determination and their growth in the world. Very, very difficult. So I'm happy to be here with you today. Next slide, please, Chloe. So we're going to be talking about the role of the volunteer supporter in the CARE Act. I just want to say, first off, for those of you who are considering becoming a volunteer supporter, thank you. I think this is a really challenging role in many respects, but I really do believe that this is an essential role for making the CARE Act process go as well as possible. The second thing I just want to say is that the respondents, the individuals who are involved in the CARE Act process, are not necessarily required, or I should say are not required to choose a volunteer supporter. If they don't want a volunteer supporter, they don't have to have one. If I had my druthers, I would advise them to have a volunteer supporter because I think it will make this process go better. So with that is some prefatory comments. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So I want to talk with you a little bit about a hypothetical case. We'll call him Ray. We have another presentation where we talk about him as well. And we're using this hypothetical as a way of illustrating some of the challenges for a volunteer supporter, but also some of the specifics of the role we would like them to play. So we'll say that Ray is a middle-aged man. He has been diagnosed with schizophrenia since his early 20s. Unfortunately, he has also other conditions. So he has alcohol use disorder. And like many people with schizophrenia who have been taking antipsychotic medicines for a long time, he has developed type 2 diabetes. And because he hasn't, unfortunately, taken very good care of his diabetes, he's developed diabetic complications, as we'll discuss in a moment. He's been in and out of mental health treatment for his whole life, I should say, since he was first diagnosed. He's not currently engaged in mental health treatment. And he also has a history of using antipsychotic medicines very inconsistently, and he's not currently taking antipsychotics. Recently, he has been going to the hospital emergency room, specifically because he has developed a diabetic complication called sensory neuropathy, where he has severe foot pain, and he's been going to the ER seeking some sort of relief for that pain. He is currently unhoused, living on the streets, not far from where he grew up in the same community. He has been approached a number of times by a homeless outreach worker who has gotten to know him, gotten to know his situation, developed some sort of rapport with him, and has referred Ray to the CARE Act proceedings. As part of the CARE Act proceedings, he has decided he would like to have a volunteer supporter, and that he decides that volunteer supporter should be his older sister. And because he knows that even though they don't see each other as often as they used to, he really does know that she loves him. But at the same time, like many of us, maybe most of us, he doesn't like to be told what to do. And as the little brother, he doesn't want to be told what to do by his older sister. And unfortunately, because one of the symptoms of his schizophrenia is a little bit of paranoia, he has paranoia about the sister's husband. He mistrusts the husband and mistrusts that the husband is having influence on the older sister. So that's a setup, and we're going to use this case to talk about the volunteer supporter role. Next slide, please. So what is a volunteer supporter? First of all, it's required to be an adult, and it's someone whose job, first and foremost, is to ensure that the respondent's needs and preferences are well represented. The volunteer supporter is not making decisions for the respondent, is not leading the respondent in any direction, but is simply somebody who is facilitating the respondent making their own decisions. The volunteer supporter is someone who's chosen by the respondent, although, as we said, the respondent may not choose to have a supporter. And that if there's conflict between a respondent and a volunteer supporter, for instance, they're not getting along well, they're arguing a lot, the volunteer supporter feels, the respondent feels intimidated by the volunteer supporter, or vice versa, actually, the volunteer supporter feels intimidated by the respondent, then the court does have the right to step in and remove that volunteer supporter and give the respondent the option of choosing somebody else to be their volunteer supporter. Next slide, please. So what does the volunteer supporter do? Well, they have a number of key responsibilities. The most important one is the one that's in bold in the right-hand column, and that is their main objective is to support the will and preferences of the respondent. Again, that does not mean they are trying to inform, they're trying to help the respondent make the most informed choice, but they're also not trying to persuade the respondent to embrace any specific point of view. And so they're here as a facilitator to go through the care process with the respondent by using supported decision-making, which we're going to talk about more in a moment. They want to help strengthen the respondent's capacity to exercise autonomous decision-making, and the volunteer supporter is there to respect the respondent's values, beliefs, and preferences. And so those are just, we're not going to go through all of these, but those are some of the key ones that volunteer supporters are expected to do as part of their role. And there are also some key principles we would like them to employ as they play this role. Next slide, please. So there are 4 key operating principles we can focus on. I'd like to turn this up to Dari now to talk about really what is maybe the most important one for this discussion, and that is supported decision making.
Thanks, Barry. So supported decision-making is a framework for decision-making, but what it really means is that the person who's making a decision has the supports and services that they need to make an informed decision. So, and that is done through a supported decision-making network, which can include family, friends, community members, and for the purposes of this conversation, the volunteer supporter. Supported decision-making really represents a paradigm shift from assuming that people with disabilities cannot make their own decisions due to their disability and need a substitute decision maker, whether it's a court-appointed decision maker or in many contexts just within personal relationships, a family member making decisions for the person instead of supporting the person to make their own decisions. And so it's really key to the CARE Act process, and it's statutorily recognized as a key principle of the process and key to the relationship, the role of a volunteer supporter within this process. I think that we have to recognize that in many cases, this will be a challenge to shift from a relationship that may have dynamics that well predate the CARE Act process and a supported decision-making framework. And that's why we're doing these trainings to really talk about different strategies and ways that the supporter can engage in supported decision-making with the CARE Act respondent.
Thank you, Dari. I also just want to point out that there is another recording specifically on supported decision making, which features Dari's explanations in detail, and is well worth viewing. The other key operating principles that a volunteer supporter needs to follow is trying, as Dari just stated, to try to overcome the challenge of not falling back into the old relationship, the historical relationship with the respondent. So if you think about Ray and his older sister, I mean, older sisters and little brothers, maybe they have certain common dynamics where an older sister may have been a second mother to a younger brother. She may have guided him at different points in his life. She may have been very, very protective of him. She may still feel that her little brother needs her and that she wants to be there for him. But all of those very good impulses means that she's looking at her little brother through a specific kind of lens, that lens of who she knows he's been through his lifetime. And that may not always allow her to see him as capable of making autonomous decisions. And so we're really asking her in playing this volunteer supporter role to as Dari says, to shift her relationship with Ray. She's got to step back from being that maybe doting, maybe nagging, maybe just a maternal older sister to somebody who is more of a facilitator, is playing more of a neutral role. This is going to be quite challenging for family members, but I think there are, if family members can adhere to this volunteer supporter role, they will be of enormous help to respondents because of the trust that may have been long established in their relationship. Other principles one is trauma-informed care, this idea that we need to just be aware that many of the respondents have had some pretty terrible experiences, maybe living in the street, maybe their paranoid delusions have terrorized them throughout their adulthood, and that we have to approach them with all gentleness and by ensuring them that they'll have a sense of safety throughout the CARE Act proceedings, and that the volunteer supporter must adhere to the principle of confidentiality. That is, anything that the respondent says to, in this case, the older sister is going to keep confidential, and unless Ray gives her explicit permission to share that information with other people. Next slide, please. So, as we've mentioned a number of times now, the volunteer supporter could be anyone the respondent chooses. We've been talking about in the context of a family relationship, but it could be a friend, a support person, it could be a faith leader, it could be someone who's been a mentor to the respondent, or it could be someone the respondent knows through a treatment context, and maybe a mental health or social service provider. Or it could be a peer support specialist who has lived experience in mental health or possibly with substance use disorder. So the only limitation here is that it needs to be somebody who is an adult. A respondent can't choose a child to play the volunteer supporter role. Next slide, please. And just to kind of spell out in a little bit more detail what a volunteer supporter can do, but also what they can't do. So with the respondent's permission, the volunteer supporter can participate in meetings, say a meeting at a behavioral health agency or a meeting in court, and can participate in communication regarding things like the respondent's psychiatric evaluation, or how their care agreement or care plan is being developed. Or they may be part of assisting them to complete a psychiatric advance directive. And by the way, there will be another presentation specifically on psychiatric advance directives. When a respondent is ready to graduate from the CARE Act proceeding, then with the respondent's permission, the volunteer supporter may be involved in the development of that graduation plan, and may, again, also be involved in judicial proceedings and status hearings for the respondent. What the volunteer supporter can't do, and we've said this again and again, is make decisions on behalf of the respondent unless it is necessary to prevent imminent harm. If the respondent is considering suicide, homicide, it's a psychiatric emergency, even without the respondent's permission, the volunteer supporter needs to take steps, make decisions in furtherance of the respondent's safety and maybe the safety of other people as well. The volunteer supporter can't sign documents on behalf of the respondent, can't decide that they no longer want to keep information confidential, decide that they have the right to share information with whoever they want. They cannot waive confidentiality. And in a court proceeding, they cannot be subpoenaed and called to testify against the respondent in any proceeding, because we want them to have that level of protection, to be a facilitator, and really do this out of the goodness of their heart without feeling like they are going to it all be pulled into a law proceeding that they have no interest in being involved in. Next slide, please. So I think all in all, this is, as I mentioned, this is an essential role, but also a very challenging role. And I'd like to invite Dari to talk with me a little bit about what other challenges might arise for volunteer supporters in helping respondents exercise as much autonomy as they're capable, but also what solutions might be in filling that role. So Dari, you've worked with a lot of volunteer supporters over the years. You've done a lot of supported decision making. What have you seen that's been challenging, but what solutions have you also seen as well?
I think one challenge is to understand that for many people, this will be a brand new kind of decision-making framework. So getting used to the framework, and in particular for the respondent, to understand that perhaps for the first time in their adult life or in many years, that they are going to make their own decisions. So just getting used to that new kind of framework can be really challenging. The solution to that is to keep doing it. This is a decision-making model or a framework. We describe it as a tool, but it's not a hammer on a nail, right? It's an ongoing framework. It's an ongoing tool that can be used and refined and will work better in some situations than others. But the key is to keep trying and to keep working on it. And also, frankly, not to get too discouraged if it doesn't work, but to say, okay, what didn't work in this instance and how can we improve it for next time? There also are many external factors that will play a role, that will pose challenges to optimizing the respondents' autonomy. And those factors can include, for example, poverty. And often the respondents are going to be struggling with just making sure they have the resources they need to survive. And so having that mental and time, the mental space and also the time to say, okay, now I need to weigh the pros and cons of every decision and I need to get all the information that I need. There may be times where that's just not feasible because the respondent has to deal with the immediate needs for food, shelter, hopefully behavioral health care as well. And, I think, of course, in the background of all of this is the psychiatric disability, mental illness, that is going to affect the way that the respondent makes decisions. And really just again and again, we'll bring up those really tough questions of, does the respondent at this point, do they have the capacity to make their own decisions? Is their mental illness somehow preventing them from articulating wishes and preferences that the volunteer supporter may be familiar with from an earlier conversation, but then in a later conversation, there's something going on that's changing their opinion. And how do you make those really tough those close calls? Those are the kinds of questions I would turn back to you, Barry, as the clinician when we're talking about the influence of the psychiatric disability. But those are just some of the challenges that I would see in really optimizing the respondent's autonomy.
I think you bring up many good points. I just want to underscore a couple of them, Dari. I mean, you talk about this is a process for volunteer supporters to learn over time, to use the tool, the framework of supported decision making, knowing it's not always going to work well, and that there may be other times when it does work well. And yes, it is a process. It's an ongoing learning experience. As part of the CARE Act introduction in counties around in California, we have trainings for volunteer supporters, this one and others, that I think ought to help them better understand their role and hopefully give them some tools and greater confidence in fulfilling this role. The other thing I'm just going to say, and I think you allude to it, but let me state it more directly, and that is one of the hallmarks of schizophrenia is paranoia. And if the respondent is paranoid about everybody, including the volunteer supporter, that even that volunteer supporter who they've chosen, it will make this process a little more difficult. And so the volunteer supporter knows, hopefully has enough background and knowledge to be able to mitigate an individual's paranoid delusions as much as possible. By assuring them, by being very gentle, by giving them more of a choice, by really supporting their autonomy, but at the same time understanding that paranoia is a manifestation of a disease that is a devastating disease and doesn't go away easily. All of which is to say that the volunteer supporter has to be very patient, has to be very versatile, very, very flexible, but in helping facilitate this conversation can do the respondent enormous good in making their best informed decision they can. So with that, I'd like to turn this back to Patricia to close us out.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks, Dari. And let's just revisit those objectives briefly. By the end of the session, you should have an increased ability to understand the responsibilities of that volunteer supporter role, and then identify some of those key listening and communication skills that Barry and Dari talked through that will ideally support a respondent's decision making and some of those key principles. Again, if you have questions on the next slide, the website has those available trainings that Barry mentioned and that I mentioned on the beginning related to supported decision making, trauma-informed care, maintaining neutrality, eliminating bias, and other topics. And then also you can email that email address if you're looking for more support or resources. So thank you for this training, joining this training.